Russian President Vladimir Putin is asserting his power after addressing the Russian military earlier today.
The Russian president condemned the rebellion carried out by the Wagner Group over the weekend, calling the mercenary forces that made their way towards Moscow traitors. Putin applauded his troops, though, for their response to the insurrection. He also granted amnesty to Wagner's leader, who is in Belarus following the uprising.
CBS News intelligence and national security reporter Olivia Gazis joins us now. Olivia, just let's start off with the role of Alexander Lukashenko and what he's doing and playing in this situation.
Absolutely. I think his center stage presence in all of these developments is really one of the biggest surprises and sources of fascination to most Western onlookers, because Alexander Lukashenko has long been something of a slightly comical bit dictator player in the region, chest beating when he's in his own element, but when in Russia, completely subordinate to the whims of Vladimir Putin. And so if you believe the Russian and Belarusian state media pronouncements on his involvement this weekend, it was Lukashenko who leveraged this long-standing relationship with Prigozhin to, of course, at the behest of Vladimir Putin, lead the negotiations and now offer what looks like a haven for both Prigozhin and the Wagner troops who took part in the rebellion. He's also touting the presence of Russian nuclear weapons on his territory. So he sure looks mighty and influential and powerful at the moment. Who knows how much of that is true, because the contours of the actual deal that he brokered are still far from clear.
You know, it sounds like Lukashenko has been somewhat celebrating the presence of Wagner and Prigozhin in his country. Although Belarus has been to some degree involved in the war, their military hasn't been as active. So what do we know about Prigozhin's presence, Wagner's presence in Belarus, and how that will play into the rest of the war?
Sure. So ostensibly, again, if you believe these pronouncements from both Moscow and Minsk, Russia is going to drop criminal charges against both Prigozhin and the Wagner troops who took up arms over the weekend, and they're going to be allowed to go inhabit an allegedly abandoned military base in Belarus, according to Lukashenko. And now it's clearly Putin's preference, if not his edict, that the remaining Wagner troops be absorbed into the broader Russian military. But there is a huge question about how workable that is in practice, given that the Russian military continues to be led for now by the same generals that Prigozhin was so adamant about ousting, and whom he's accused not only of treason, but of killing Wagner forces in Ukraine. But as for Prigozhin, you know, he's for now lived to fight another day. I think it is a day-to-day existence at the moment, and what remains to be seen is what kind of treatment he's going to be receiving in Belarus and for how long.
Olivia, we're seeing Putin try to rally support. Is it working?
Yeah, I mean, as you showed at the top, there's now this, clear, concerted effort by him to show himself publicly, to hail Russian unity and strength, and to allow these public sightings of at least one of the generals that, again, Prigozhin was so adamant about ousting. But as with so many things in Russia, there's this kind of surreal Potemkin quality to all of that pageantry, because how do you credibly extol the valor of Russian defenders who were in actuality nowhere to be seen as those Wagner troops were overtaking Rostov? Right. Credibly, you don't, but, Putin appears to be getting away with it. And I think what you're seeing, the more this plays out, the more time passes and the more the chips fall, the view now is Putin's Russia is continuing to be Putin's Russia. And so even if the optics of this weekend were suggestive of his weakness, it looks like he's, again, reconsolidating power, sidelining his rivals, and just carrying on as he has now for over 2 decades as Russia's strongman.
Okay, what does U.S. intelligence know about the friction between Prigozhin, Putin, the generals? What do we know at this point?
Sure. I mean, more than they are publicly saying, right? I mean, what we do know is that both U.S. and Western intelligence services were really closely tracking a buildup, this growing public feud between Prigozhin and the Russian military. The U.S. appears to have had the kind of most precision of the where, the what, and the when of everything happening, and had been briefing stakeholders here about, something combustible coming on the horizon. The thing is that even if that was interesting to know and, essential for planning and contingency purposes, for operational purposes, it kind of makes little difference, because neither the U.S. nor anybody in the West wanted to be anywhere near this situation, seen as meddling or orchestrating it, because they've described it routinely as an internal Russian affair and have taken very, very many steps to distance themselves completely from it.
Olivia Gazis, thank you so much.
Thank you.
George Beebe joins us now. He is the director of grand strategy at the Quincy Institute and a former CIA Russia analysis chief. He spent more than 2 decades in government as an intelligence analyst, diplomat, and policy advisor. George, it's great to have you. As you know, Putin has been accused of assassinating foes for far less. Are you surprised Prigozhin is still alive?
Well, I'm not really. I think Putin's primary concern in all of this was to avoid a descent into a civil war in Russia. That would have not only posed a threat to his own rule, but it also could have diverted the Russian military from the war in Ukraine and offer Ukraine an opportunity to win this war outright. So that would have been a disastrous scenario. I think he still has that goal in mind in how he's treating Prigozhin and the commanders of the Wagner Group that joined Prigozhin in this uprising. He does not want to see this get any worse than it already has. And so I think he's trying to provide some incentives for everybody to cool things off. His treatment, I think, of Prigozhin is very pragmatic in that regard.
I mean, and the stakes are in the billions. One thing that Olivia was detailing just now, Beebe, is that the goal, or at least something that has been discussed, has been for the Wagner Group militants to be absorbed into the Russian military. And we were just wondering, I mean, is that possible? Do the leaders of the Russian military that Prigozhin has issues with need to go for that to happen? And can all of these soldiers actually come together after this mutiny?
Well, I think when it comes to the rank and file, the grunts, so to speak, that are on the front lines holding the rifles, that is probably possible. A lot of these are mercenaries. They're people who are willing to fight for people that are willing to pay them to fight. And in this particular case, I think a lot of these fighters are going to realize that Prigozhin is no longer going to be able to pay them. The Russian state will be able to pay them. So I think a lot of them will, in fact, sign contracts with the Russian Ministry of Defense. That, of course, doesn't apply to Prigozhin personally, and it probably won't apply to a lot of Wagner's commanders. They're the ones that really had the personal feuds with the high command of the Russian military. They're the ones who I don't think are going to be willing to live under the command of the regular Russian army. So I think the bottom line is part of Wagner probably will be absorbed into the Russian military.
And George, you know, the big question, how do you think the United States should respond to this situation?
Well, I think the Biden administration has handled this very well so far. I think they were acutely sensitive to the potential for Putin trying to spin this into some sort of American attempt to foment instability inside Russia. And they were very careful not to give Putin any ammunition to use to try to advance that story. Now, he has tried nonetheless to blame this on the United States, but I don't think he's really going to get very far with that, given the way the Biden administration has handled things. And I think more broadly, the White House has been aware that although diverting Russia from the war in Ukraine in the short term would be a good thing for prospects in that war for Ukraine, we also have other issues at stake here. Russia, of course, has the world's largest nuclear arsenal. And when you start talking about real instability inside Russia and the possibility of anarchy, then you have to be concerned about the fate of that nuclear arsenal. Who will control it? Would it fall into the hands of people that would try to use it in some way? And I think the White House is trying to balance all these interests. And so far, they've done a pretty good job of that.
George Beebe, Director of Grand Strategy at the Quincy Institute and former CIA Russia analysis chief. Thank you for that wisdom.
You're welcome.